Thanks, Dennis, for leading us in those wonderful songs this morning. And thanks to you who cooperated this morning by moving a little bit closer to the front. I could certainly tell a noticeable difference. And that's not a bad habit to be in, especially during the summer months when our crowds are a little bit lower than when our university students are here and school is in session. So something to keep in mind throughout the coming weeks of the summer. Henry Terrell, thank you so much for your wonderful words as we gathered around the table this morning, for reminding us of the simplicity of the sacrifice of Christ and yet the great significance of it. Thank you so much for your wonderful words. And Mike, for your prayer today, we're most grateful. Will you take your Bible this morning and be opening to Psalm 139. Psalm 139. Now, while you're doing that, let me welcome everyone. And again, we're glad you're here. If you are a member of the church family at Westside, we're so thankful for you. I love this church. I'm telling you, we are just so blessed with such a wonderful church family here at Westside. And I count it a privilege every single day to be a part of this great family. Tammy and I do. And sometimes we just, we've been here 6 years soon, and we just sometimes still pinch ourselves to see if this is real. We really do. It's just an awesome privilege for us to be here with you, and you are a blessing to us. And to all of our guests, welcome. We're so glad you've joined us today, as well as those who are joining us on Facebook Live, streaming. We reach out to people across the country, and somebody told me even recently, we've got some folks that listen to us, watch us regularly in Alberta, Canada. So, hey, everyone in Canada, glad to have you along today. If you're watching from Alberta, we're glad that you've joined us by means of this wonderful new technology, and we're grateful for the men in our congregation who know how to tap into that and are helping us to utilize it, I want to begin this morning by asking you to ask yourself a question. Will you ask yourself this question? Why did God make me? Ask yourself that question. Why did God make me? You ever wondered about that? Why did God make you? What was the reason that He created you? What is the purpose that God has in your life? You are a unique individual. Do you realize how unique you really are? There is not another person alive who is just like you are. Just as there are no two snowflakes that are identical, there are no two human beings that are identical. There has never been, there is not now, nor will there ever be anyone who is exactly like you. Now, there may be people who look like you. There may be even people who might talk or have the same mannerisms like you, but there will never be anyone who has duplicated your background, your experience, your pathway in life. And as a result, each one of you this morning is a unique individual. Now, why did God make you? God has a purpose, I believe, for all of us. And for our lives to be fulfilled, we must understand something about the purpose for which God has created us. Because to live outside of that purpose is to live a life of frustration and futility. God created a fish to live in the water, right? You put that fish in the water and he's pretty happy. He's swimming along there. He's a pretty content fella. But take that fish and set him up in a deer stand in a tree. He's not going to be very happy for long, is he? I don't think so. God created an eagle for the purpose of soaring in the heavens above the beautiful countryside. But you take that eagle and tie his foot with a rope and tie that to a root in a barnyard, that eagle is not going to be a happy eagle. By the way, I saw a poster the other day that said, it's hard to soar with eagles when you work with a bunch of turkeys. That's no reflection on who I work with. I don't mean that at all. But you know what I'm saying. Boy, to be created for such a wonderful purpose and yet to not be able to fulfill that purpose leads to a life of futility. So if we're going to understand why God made us, we must know something about God. And we must understand something about God's purposes in creation. This is where Psalm 139 comes into play. For here, the psalmist provides us with 4 beautiful definitions of God's purpose and plan for our lives. Make sure you catch them. There are 4 of them we're going to look at. Number 1, you ready? Here we go. God is always with us. Is that right? No, that's not right. God knows everything. That's it. I forget sometimes. God knows everything about me. I was getting a step ahead of myself. God knows everything about me. How does that make you feel? Is it a little bit scary? God knows everything about me. Look at what the psalmist says right here in Psalm 139, verse 1. When he says, "Search, you, O Lord, have searched me and know me." You have searched me and you know me. What does God know about us? Well, Jesus tells us in Matthew 10, verse 30, that God's knowledge of us is so comprehensive that even the very hairs of our head are numbered. God knows every little detail about us, but God knows more. God can not only see us, but he sees through us. God knows our hearts. He knows our motivations. He knows our emotions. You know, there is something about a mother's instinct with her children. I see this with my wife and our children. A mother has a way of knowing when something is wrong in the life of one of her children. There's just that mother's instinct. You've seen it, that instinctiveness. And I can remember my mother when she was living, even up until I was in my late 40s and 50 years old about, before my mom passed away. But I can still remember there would be times when my mother would say, "Something's bothering you." And I'd say, "Oh, no, Mom, it's okay." And she would say, No. I know you well enough to know something is bothering you." Now, do you ladies know what I'm talking about? Nod your head. Absolutely. And I see this with my wife. Sometimes she'll talk to one of our children. She says, "Something's wrong." "Well, what's wrong?" "Well, I don't know, but I can just tell. Something is wrong." Well, let me tell you, that's God. God knows us and has tried us. He not only knows the number of hairs on our head, but God knows every single thing about you. Now, the psalmist is pretty specific. First of all, he says God knows our character. He knows our motivations, our emotions. He knows what makes us tick. Somebody said reputation is what other people think about you. Character is what God knows about you. God knows our character. Number 2, God knows our conduct. Look here, if you will, at verses 2 and 3. The psalmist says, "You know my sitting down and my rising up." And in verse 3, he says, "You scrutinize my path, and when I lie down, you are intimately acquainted with all my ways." Let me tell you about something a preacher I read about recently. Preacher's name is Peter Lord. And I don't know where he preaches or whatever, but I heard about this. I thought it was a pretty neat little illustration. He was preaching from this passage about God knowing everything about us. So one morning at church, he, before church, went up in the attic above the auditorium. Now, we don't have an attic in this auditorium, the way that the structure is built, but he went up in the attic above the auditorium, and he had a little hole up there where he could look down and see the entire audience. Now, naturally, everybody was wondering where the preacher was. He wasn't in the usual place where he sat, and as the songs passed and the communion and everything, the preacher wasn't there, and everybody thought, what's going on? Finally, the time came for the sermon. There was no one in the pulpit. And all of a sudden, there was a voice. Good morning. This is your preacher. You can't see me, but I can see you. Sister Jones, I see you going through your purse. Sherry and Sandra, I see you talking. Bill, I see you texting. John, I see you're looking on Facebook. Now, can you imagine that? How does it make you feel to know that God sees everything you do? Conduct. By the way, you know why God sees everything that you can do? Some people look upon God as being this mean ogre who is just looking for something that, bam, he can get us. Zap, I caught you doing something. That's not it at all, my friend. The reason God sees what you're doing is he loves you so much, he can't take his eyes off of you. Do you understand that? He loves you so much, he can't take his eyes off of you. God sees our contemplations, our thoughts. Look in verse 2. You know my thoughts from afar. God understands what we're thinking. He knows what you're thinking right now. He knows if you're listening to the sermon, or he knows if you're thinking about what you're going to have for lunch, or what you're going to be doing this afternoon, or what you're going to be doing this evening. Church time rolls around. God knows your thoughts. And God knows our conversation. Here in verse 4, he says, even before there's a word on my tongue, you know it. Even before there's a word on my tongue, you know it. Do you mean to tell me, preacher, that God knows everything I say? You got it. God knows everything I say? Yep. It's kind of like a little boy showed up at church. Preacher was going to be eating lunch with him. So he saw the little boy, Billy, said, Billy, come into your house today. What are we having? Billy looked up and said, buzzard. He said, preacher thought buzzard. He thought, that's new. I've eaten a lot of roast beef and plenty of fried chicken. But buzzard? He said, are you sure? And he said, yep. On the way to church, Mom said we were having the old buzzard for lunch. You don't think God hears what you say? It's no wonder Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12, verse 27, that we shall give an account for every idle word. By your words you shall be justified, and by your words you shall be condemned. God knows everything about us. Now, here's number 2. God is always with us. Always. Look here at Psalm 139. Look at verse 5. When the psalmist says, you have enclosed me behind and before, your hand is laid upon me. And he says, this is such a wonderful thing. It's such a high thought that I cannot even attain to it, that God is always with us. How meaningful that is. You remember back in September of 2001, on September 11th, when the terrorists attacked the World Trade Centers in Washington, D.C., hijacked the planes. One of those planes crashed in Pennsylvania. Another one crashed into the Pentagon in Washington. Then the Twin Towers in New York. There was an interview, a reporter on CNN interviewing a woman named Anne Graham Lotz. Anne Graham Lotz. Anne Graham Lotz is the daughter of the evangelist Billy Graham. And this reporter asked Anne Graham Lotz there on CNN, this reporter said, "Where was God today? In the midst of all of these terrible attacks, where was God?" And I thought Anne Lotz gave a tremendous answer. She said, God was right there. God was right there, comforting those who were in turmoil, in the hearts of the first responders, in those families. But then she added something. She said, "It seems to me somewhat peculiar that a society that for the last generation has been saying on every hand to God, 'We don't want you in our country and our society,' suddenly we're asking where he is." But the psalmist says, God is always with me. Look at this. He is with us in spite of distance. Verse 7. Where can I hide from your spirit? How can I flee from you? You remember Jonah? God called him to go preach to Nineveh. Jonah didn't want to go to that Gentile city of Nineveh, even though it was a great city of its day. And so Jonah got in a boat there at Joppa and started sailing toward Tarshish, the furthermost navigable point in the western Mediterranean. Guess what? He couldn't outrun God. God was with him every step of the way. And if you try, here's the thing about it. If you try, my friend, if you try to outrun God, whenever you get where you're going, guess what? God's already going to be there. You can't outrun God. What about death? Will death separate us from God? Look at what the psalmist says. If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If my body is laid in Sheol, you are there. Death doesn't separate us from the lordship of God. Even an unbeliever will one day confess Jesus as Lord to the glory of the Father, according to Philippians 2. You see, God is always with us. Not even darkness. The psalmist says, I was overwhelmed by darkness, but then I realized that with you, darkness is as light. Our night is like day. There is darkness and light are alike to God. God is always with us. What a thought. Number 4, God has a purpose for you. Verse 12. You have woven my inward parts. You have created my inward parts. You have woven me in my mother's womb. God has known you since you were conceived. Since you were conceived in your mother's womb, God has known you. You say, preacher, I don't believe that. Well, you can disagree with me if you want to, but what are you going to do with Jeremiah 1:5 when God told Jeremiah, when you were in your mother's womb, I knew you? What are you going to do with that one? You see, God has a purpose for us. And even when we were conceived and God began that process of knitting together our bodies in our mother's womb, and that heart began to beat at just a few weeks, and that body began to take shape in the eyes and the ears and the hands and the feet, and it began to grow. God has known us. I know that some of you ladies have had the heartbreak of miscarriage. But I want you to understand fully, God has known that baby that you were carrying. God knows us. The psalmist couldn't help but to say, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your deeds, O Lord, and I know it very well. God has a purpose in creating us. He has woven us together. That makes you a very special and unique individual. Oh, so special. Well, then the fourth one, the last one, look at this. God has you on his heart constantly. God has you on his heart constantly. Look down at verses 17 and 18. There the psalmist says, how can you sum up God's thoughts, the total of them? If the total sum of God's thoughts for you were to be calculated, they would be greater, the psalmist says, than the sands of the seashore. And you take all the sand and you just multiply. Look at all of that. Imaginable, unimaginable. And yet, God's thoughts towards us, what does it mean for God to have us on his heart? Well, some of you folks, some of you younger couples, you remember when you first met that guy or that gal who later proposed to you or you proposed to them and they said yes. You remember when you first started dating? And some of you not so young. You remember when you first started dating your mate? They were on your heart. I mean, they were on your heart. You thought about them all the time. You would write them notes. You would send them a text message. You would give them a call. They were on your heart continually. And that's the way you are with God. Somebody says, how can I be on God's heart? There are over 7 billion people in the world. Folks, he's God. His ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His capacity is so much greater than anything we can even begin to comprehend. But you, uniquely, individually, are on his heart. James Anderson was telling me this past week, we were having a coffee together one morning, as we often do early in the mornings, sitting there talking, and he was telling me about a visit that he had made several weeks ago out here to the Crossings, the rehabilitation center. And while he was there, and I'm not going to mention the couple's name, but a lot of you will know who I'm talking about, he said while he was there, he saw a couple sitting at a table out in one of the little dining areas there. This couple has been married for 74 years, almost 75, and they were sitting there holding hands. Holding hands. God longs to hold hands with you because you're on his heart. More than anything else, he wants you to know of his love. See, the devil wants us to think all kinds of weird stuff about God. And the devil wants us to think that God is just out to get us. The devil wants us to think of God as a mean spiritual ogre. The devil wants us to think that God is too busy for us. The devil wants us to think that we're not worthy of God's love and compassion and grace? Of course we're not. But it's not based upon our worthiness, but upon who He is. I mentioned that 911 a moment ago, the September 11th. The cell phone calls that were being made from people stranded in those Twin Towers or aboard those aircraft. What were they like? Hey, make sure you take out the trash. No. Hey, make sure, did you pay the light bill? Make sure you get that paid now. No. What were they? I love you. I love you. I love you. And that is the message God is trying to send to you every single day through His Son, Jesus Christ. You see, God doesn't leave anything to chance. He's revealed His power through the splendor and glory of creation. He's revealed His will for us through His Word, and He has revealed His love for us through the gift of His Son, Jesus. I read a little interesting story this week about Albert Einstein, the great physicist. Einstein was, of course, a brilliant individual, developed the theory of relativity, unlocking the atomic age, and yet sometimes in the most simple tasks, he had some difficulty. On one evening, as he was taking the train from his office to his home, he had misplaced his train ticket. The conductor came around and Einstein began trying to find his ticket. And the conductor said, "That's okay, Mr. Einstein. You ride this train every evening. I see you. It's not a problem. I know who you are. We'll just settle up tomorrow night." And Einstein said, "You don't understand. Without that ticket, I don't have a clue what station to get off at." Well, folks, let me tell you, some of you this morning just don't have a clue what station to get off at because you don't understand why God has created you. This morning, I want you to know that God knows everything about you. He's always with you. He has a purpose for you. And you are always on His mind. If that is the type of God who appeals to you, accept His invitation today. Come in response to His word. Confess your faith, repent of your sins, and be buried with Christ in baptism while we stand and while we sing.